Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I truly hope you are safe and well. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm really pleased and honored to welcome to the program two very special guests. Tino Cuéllar, Carnegie's 10th president, a former justice of the Supreme Court of California. Tino has served three U.S. presidential administrations at the White House and in federal agencies. He was the Stanley Morrison Professor at Stanford University, where he held appointments in law, political science, and international affairs, and led the university's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Jack Goldsmith, learned hand professor of law at Harvard Law School, a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and co-founder of that extraordinary site, Lawfare. He teaches and writes about presidential power, national security law, federal courts, conflict of laws, international law, and internet law. Gentlemen, welcome to Carnegie Connects. This is the 104th interview we've done since the heart of COVID in March of 2020. I do not imagine one that is more timely and more critically important. I had historian Doug Brinkley on this show not too long ago. He made a very strong case that America, this republic, to use his words, was built to last. I believe that. We've had crises before, including the Civil War, which the worst crisis any nation could confront. And we've weathered them. But I would argue we've never quite been here before. We're watching an aggrandizement of presidential power on an unprecedented scale, never in our history. Tino Cuéllar writes in his recent article in Foreign Affairs, has the country, quote, faced such a massive flood the zone strategy by a president who muses openly about a third term. Or as Jack Goldsmith, writing recently in the New York Times, described the administration's, quote, systematic disrespect of judicial process, its extortionate abuse of government power to crush foes, and its destructive language and nastiness. I have had 27 years working and voting for Republicans and Democrats. I've never seen anything quite like this. One final point, just data point. It's stunning to me that in the first hours of President Trump's presidency, he did what no other president has ever done. He directly assaulted the Constitution in an executive order on birthright citizenship, declaring that the administration would no longer treat U.S.-born children of undocumented immigrants or children of lawful temporary immigrants as citizens, as the 14th Amendment directs. So, where are we? Where do we go from here? I'd like to divide the conversation into four parts. One, how severe is the threat? What are the guardrails that exist? Can they work? Do they work? And finally, what are the future? So let's start with the threat. If remedy depends on an accurate and an objective assessment of the situation, where are we? Jack, let me start with you. You've described Trump's actions as, quote, a moonshot on executive power, end quote, which suggests to me ambition on one hand, but also a very discrete target, moonshot, on the other. What exactly did you mean by that? And what do you think the administration is up to with respect to executive power?
Sure. Thank you very much, Aaron, for having me. By moonshot, I simply meant that they had a wildly outsized ambition to take executive power to a new place or something like that. And as for the ends of power, I can talk about the elements of that if you want me to. The ends of power, I mean, it's not quite clear what it is. I mean, Trump has, a set of agenda items. Sometimes they're in flux. I mean, he clearly cares about certain things a lot, other things he cares about on and off. The main thing that it aims to do is to satisfy Trump's whims. So that's, I think, a lot of what the executive power construct is about. But they clearly have sort of agenda items about the nature of executive power. I'm happy to flesh it out if you want me to.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. So I think there are two lanes on which Trump is doing new things. One lane is the lane of what I'll call taking past presidential precedents and taking them to huge new places. That is things like, a lot of the unitary executive stuff about firing and organizing the administration and, um, presidential administration, controlling the administration. A lot of this stuff builds on precedents going back to 1980 in the Reagan administration. And it takes them, I think Doge, for example, is an extreme case of presidential administration that's been building for 40 years. That uses techniques, many of which have been used before, but takes it in a much more extreme level, as Tino said in his piece. It's flooding the zone and taking it to new places. And there are things in that lane where they're expanding presidential power along channels of before. But the quotes you mentioned at the beginning from my New York Times piece, I think these are some of the things that are new and most dangerous. And this overlaps with something later in the conversation. They're new in attacking the typical guardrails. They are focused like a laser beam on attacking the guardrails to check presidential power. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Inside an administration, there are legal and norm-based checks that are hugely important in keeping the president constrained and accountable, and they have systematically eliminated those, including any lawyer-based or legal constraints inside the executive branch on what the president does. That may be the most dangerous thing that they're doing. And I'll just mention one more and I'll be quiet, and that is weaponization, using government in an extreme and often extortionate way, by which I mean they take illegal ends to extract gains, to basically crush their enemies, especially in civil society, which is another source of power that of constraint on the executive that they're trying to stop. So those latter two things, I believe, are new.
Yeah. Tino, let me ask you, we've had presidents that, all presidents to some degree expand their presidential prerogatives. Lincoln, FDR, Nixon for sure in the imperial presidency. You spent some time in your foreign affairs piece identifying exactly, I guess it's an extension of what Jack just said. How is this in critical ways different than what we've seen before? It's not business as usual, even though there are past precedents, as Jack indicated. Why isn't this business as usual?
Thank you, Aaron, and glad to be here, especially with my friend Jack, whom I very much admire. Let's go back to what the core problem is to start with. Fundamentally, the problem that America faces right now is a version of the problem it's always faced, which is how to make democracy work effectively. What the founding fathers tried to design was a framework that allowed us to split the atom of sovereignty, making sure we didn't concentrate power too much in any one institution. But at the same time, to learn from the Articles of Confederation and empower a president, somebody who had the authority to execute the laws effectively and to make sure to shape the national conversation about where the country should go. To a first approximation, there are different variations in how you say that. But we have had decades and decades of fighting as a result of who does what in our system by design. I would say you can read the Federalist Papers, see what James Madison had to say, what Alexander Hamilton had to say. They wouldn't have been surprised that time and again, decade after decade, you'd get some fights about what is the limit of congressional power to appropriate money, for example, in very specific ways that might arguably constrain the president's power to be commander-in-chief, or how might we balance the president's authority to execute the court's authority to effectively say what the law is. What is different today feels to me like it falls into three buckets, picking up exactly where Jack left off. First, it's one thing to have disagreements with Congress about how much power the president has to interpret the law, to maybe shape enforcement discretion. It's another thing to actually issue executive orders specifically targeting individuals or organizations. Second, there's a degree of swagger, let's put it this way, with respect to actions that arguably directly benefit financially the person or the people in and around the White House. So I'm talking about open discussion about or execution of a plan to get a cryptocurrency started, to have contact directly with the president in exchange for certain kind of action that might benefit the president financially. And then third is this flood the zone point. Presidents have historically sometimes had disagreements with others about the limits of their power. But if you take birthright citizenship, we're trying to do away with independent agencies, trying to assert control over impoundment and not spending money Congress has appropriated, doing away with the internal checks and balances of the executive branch, of not relying on the Justice Department all at once, you get a somewhat different dynamic.
The second point you made on the line between what the president sees as the national interest and his own financial interest is an important one, because it seems to me, and it's an issue that I'm not sure we may have dealt with it in the past, but not on the level of scale. I mean, I'm just watching the president's trip to the Middle East and the offer that the Qataris are only too happy to provide of a 747, which is, it roughly costs about $400 million a piece. It'd have to be retrofitted, but it'd be for use, assuming they could get it retrofitted within the next year or two. It would be also for his use after the presidency. So would either of you speak just on this specific issue? I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I think it's important, on the whole issue of the emoluments clause and how you see the whole issue of self-dealing as a pretty, it may have a long history, but this is really quite extraordinary, it seems to me. And it's back to Jack's point that when I asked Jack what the point of all this was, I think Jack said, well, subordinated to the president's whims. I think that's a very good answer, because I think it's the grievances, prejudgments, financial interests, political interests. I'd question whether or not there's a concept of the so-called national interest, but what about the self-dealing issue? Jack?
So it's pervasive. And it's hard to exaggerate how much they have organized the administration to permit self-dealing. This presidency did not issue an executive order on ethics. The president set up a mechanism that basically, in contrast to all prior presidents, including President Trump and Trump 1, is basically designed to enrich the Trump organization. As you said, they're benefiting expressly off of regulation of cryptocurrencies. The president, you can pay and to get to see the president, you pay into his campaign coffers. They have, in the last example, they have or they've stopped enforcing anti-corruption law in the Justice Department. And then there's the foreign emoluments taking this gift of the airplane. It is systematic. The problem is it's open. They're not hiding the ball here.
No.
And this is, in a way, corrosive, because it's happening openly and nothing much is happening in response. And if you think about last time, remember what a big deal we used to make about income tax disclosure? Trump blew through that one. Nobody talks about it anymore. So I really worry about where these norms are going to be, and whether he's openly flouting them with no apparent pushback.
And let's be clear, just to build on Jack's point. So some of these issues that are being discussed right here come out in media reports, and we'll see if they get confirmed or not. But it's easy enough for the White House to say something like, the idea that a large, valuable plane might be turned over and then made available to the Trump organization, that's ridiculous. How would the president, fake news, right? That's never going to happen. But I notice not a response right at this point, unless it's happening right now as we speak. So that's sort of telling in its own right. But I also wanted to double click on something Jack said that feels pretty significant and is complicated. We have a system of separated powers that reflects both some humility, ideally, on the part of every branch, that they understand that they're not all calling the shots for the country, but they're sharing power in some significant way. And yet, they also pay attention not only to the limits of their powers, but also what the historical norms are and how those powers are used. That's the essential backdrop to so much of what ends up in a court case or in a State of the Union speech. And what we're living through right now is not only a rapid change in the willingness of an administration to challenge settled law on a whole bunch of different fronts, again, like appropriations, birthright citizenship, government control over reorganization of agencies, and so on. We're also living through rapid change with respect to the norms. Yeah. And as Jack knows well, because he's written about this too, there is a limit to a court's ability to police norms. They're norms and not law for a reason. But we then imagine living in a democracy where people are sensitive not only to outright violations of the law, but to changes in norms and discuss them, talk about them, say, well, maybe this is a good norm to change. Maybe we should never have expected the president to issue an executive order on ethics. And when actually that change in norms should feed into our political process and debate and create some reappraisal of what's right and wrong.
Right. Before we move on to the issue of identifying what the set of guardrails is today, I want to ask two questions. They're media questions. I'm intrigued by them. Are we, and I know, Jack, you've spoken to this issue, are we in a constitutional crisis? Is that even a relevant question to ask? Are we in a rule of law crisis? And how would we know that we actually are or were in a constitutional crisis?
So, with respect, I don't, and I know you don't necessarily expect me to give a full answer. I don't like the question because of the second point you made. I mean, there's no, we're not in a good place on the rule of law now, and I'll say what I mean by that. But this idea of constitutional crisis is massively underdefined and massively overused. We're definitely moving in a bad direction because the president of the United States is challenging every element of what constitutes and upholds the rule of law. He's challenging every element of it. And so that is obviously not a good thing. But I also want to say, believe it or not, it's very early. I know we're all exhausted. We're about 110 or 20 days in. It's very early. It's not clear where this is going to go. So all I can say is we're in a very bad place, in many ways an unprecedentedly bad place, mainly because of the lack of constraints within the executive branch and the lack of constraints coming from Congress. But I don't know what the metrics are for crisis.
Right. So you couldn't, if a federal court or the Supreme Court issued a ruling and a directive, and the president of the United States decided, I mean, the apocryphal story with Andrew Jackson, the Chief Justice made his ruling, now let him enforce it. Would that constitute a constitutional crisis? The willful?
I mean, it would be a very bad and almost unprecedented thing. But I couldn't say, again, I'm not trying to be coy. I don't know what a constitutional crisis is. And a lot of it would depend on what happened after that.
Right.
I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. A lot of it would depend on how the nation reacted.
Exactly.
In the next day, the next month, the next year.
It gets to Tino's point about the courts are necessary, but not sufficient. Necessary, but not sufficient. Tino, your notion of that?
Yeah, or just say, Jack was smart enough not to get an article published that had the title "How to Survive a Constitutional Crisis."
Sorry.
So I'm on the hook to say something about this because I did have an article that has that title. Look, I would say, to me, a constitutional crisis, which is familiar from what happens in a number of other countries, is where the basic charter of government either has no answer for some problem that requires an answer given political conflict at an intense level, or has an answer and the answer is being ignored. And here, I would say, we're not yet in a constitutional crisis, by my definition. We're instead in the early innings of an administration that has 2 or 3 separate agendas that are pretty bold. There is a bold policy agenda, and I think Jack and I would agree, and this is an important point, that the president has a lot of power over foreign affairs, what legislation to propose, with the consent of the Senate, what people to appoint to different positions. There's a bold agenda there. There's an agenda around reimagining and redefining certain norms that maybe one wishes were not completely cast aside, but there's some leeway there. And then there's an agenda around rebalancing or re-narrating the law and effectively pushing back settled legal interpretations. So amidst all that stuff, there's a lot of friction, there's a lot of debate, there's some worrisome behaviors on the part of the administration. But I think so far, this is where I would take the conversation. And, Jack may look at it this way or may disagree slightly, or you may disagree, Aaron, as an informed citizen. I think the Constitution provides a straightforward set of answers to a lot of the questions that are being asked, including, to my mind, the question of what happens when a court fairly unambiguously is ruling in a domain of the court's competence. And the question becomes does that have a role to play in shaping how the executive acts? Can the executive simply disregard, say, no, that's not a decision I want to pay any attention to? And I think it's fairly clear that in our system as it's evolved, the president doesn't get the right to just ignore a court judgment that way. There's some leeway the president has in interpreting it and responding to it. But I think we're still in a situation where all the evidence I've seen indicates to me that this administration's a little reluctant to simply have a speech that is full-throated departmentalist in the narrowest sense of the word, which is to say, we view our role in taking care that the laws be faithfully executed as having a complete leeway in deciding what that means. The courts are irrelevant, right? I don't see this administration at this point having said that, or likely saying that, which means the problem is a harder one than is there a constitutional crisis? Because frankly, we can end up in a terrible place for the rule of law without any hard and fast, obvious constitutional crisis. And it can be the tendentiousness with which it may be a super narrow technical interpretation is given to a court judgment. And all around it, the spirit of the court's judgment is kind of ignored, for example, or where the president uses a set of unambiguous powers the president has to do some things that still are harsh in going after enemies the president might be perceived to have or might perceive himself to have. And that worries me as well, because it means that protecting the rule of law is more than about just making sure we survive a constitutional crisis. It's also about living up to the ideals of the country more generally.
Yeah. I'm reminded of the quip Harry Truman said about Nixon. He may have read the Constitution, but he didn't understand it. I fear that in this administration, people have in fact read the Constitution quite carefully and are looking for all kinds of ways to interpret and get around it, which brings, well,
can I say something?
I wish
more?
I had
In
2
some
hours
cases,
with
I mean,
you.
both Jack and I have written about how the fight over presidential power is a thing that is constantly recurring and it will not disappear.
Right.
And it has been with us for a while. But I think there's a question of like, what does it mean to act in good faith, right? What does it mean to say, oh, I might disagree about how much power I have as president to shape the enforcement of these laws where I can't go after everybody. So I have to pick and choose like who's a priority target, or my administration does at least. But is that the same as saying, I'm going to go after this law firm, right? That it feels to me that somewhere in between the two, a line is crossed.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the issue of guardrails. And I just offer a soapbox comment, opera comment on this. It strikes me, looking at the scope of American history, that the real constraint, the real guardrail, and there are 2. And I think the founders believed in both. One is a president who understood the concept of public virtue. That is to say that the interests of the community, the whole, turning the M in me upside down so it becomes a W in we, that's really, really important. That's a huge constraint. And the other is the founders believed in moral self-governance, the capacity of a human, of a leader, to control their own demons, their passions, and their desires in the interest of public virtue. I mean, I've never seen a president who appears to have no concept of either one. But now to the issue of guardrails. Jack, to you, if you just laid them out in a broad brush form, what would they be?
First of all, I want to underscore what you just said, because frankly, it's the most important one. I mean, the person and the character and the values of the person elected by the American people. At the end of the day, we can talk about law and constitutional structure, and I'm going to go through it in just 1 second, but none of it's going to work if you have a president who has no constraints, who doesn't have checks and balances, as Schlesinger said, stitched into his breast, if they don't have the moral self-governance and public virtue that you just described. So I really want to say, at bottom, that is the most important thing. Okay, formal guardrails. So, you in high school constitutional law, you learn that there are 3 branches of government and that the branches are a check upon one another. And one of those, and so what is checking the presidency in that model is the Congress is not checking the president right now. Very, very occasionally, Ed Martin, who was the appointee for the U.S. attorney slot in the District of Columbia, wasn't going to receive consent. But it's barely any check at all right now on the president, and that is massively important. So in the traditional scheme, you have courts now, which are the only check in it, but it's worse than that, because the traditional scheme was supplemented by at least 2 other forms of checks. One were the internal checks inside the executive branch, and this has been massively important since the 1970s, since Watergate and other 1960s and 70s episodes. Through norms and law, Congress and presidents have placed all sorts of constraints inside the executive branch. And as I said earlier, Trump has systematically eliminated those. And that is in many ways the most corrosive action they've taken in terms of eliminating checks. Finally, there's civil society. There's that through politics and through courts can engage and push back on the executive branch. That has been severely weakened by this administration. And so basically the checks left on the presidency are the courts, which are under a relentless attack and basically have only the power of judgment, as Hamilton put it. They don't have the sword or the purse. And ultimately they depend on the people for their support. And then there's a weakened civil society. And then there's kind of a dim constraint in politics. So we're at a point of diminished constraints.
Could you add the markets?
Yes, that's an excellent point. I do think that's a very important point. Why is it that, yes, with regard to the Fed, with regard to pushback on tariffs, I would add the markets. I think that's a massively important constraint, actually. Tino,
over to you.
Yeah.
I know you've written about this.
I think Jack put it very nicely in a couple ways. And you did too, Aaron. Let me start with the point you made, which I think is not disconnected from what the founding fathers believed, which was that virtue really mattered in the end. They thought these oaths of office that people would take would matter. They thought that some selection process that would select for people who had some kind of bearing and sense of their role in the world would be helpful. History is complicated, and I think over time it's pretty clear that some assumptions that were made early in the country's history have not borne out. Let's take Congress, which Jack alluded to as well. So the idea that Congress would mostly be animated by protecting its own prerogatives institutionally, rather than advancing a set of partisan interests of the majority, that's proven to be very questionable over time. So I think right now the answer to your question has to start by going through what plausible constraints, including ones that have played a role in American history and the history of other countries, are actually not so helpful right now. Congress would be one example. For a variety of reasons we can go into, power works differently in Congress. And as long as there are two houses of Congress controlled by the same party as the president, and the president is viewed as popular enough to really be a player in primaries that might be launched against sitting members of Congress and might be viewed as the legitimate leader of that party, you can't really count on Congress to the same degree, with some exceptions here and there. The bureaucracy, or the civil service, if you want to put it that way, between the casting aside of norms around internal constraints, like the reliance on the Office of Legal Counsel, which normally helps shape what interpretations of the executive branch are considered acceptable. So that's getting cast aside, plus the reality that DOGE and related efforts are keeping the bureaucracy off balance. Maybe it's a good thing to reform some of the bureaucracy on occasion. But wherever you land on the question of like, how well does the bureaucracy work, treating it as a major constraint right now is not a really winning strategy. Political parties. So the framers were concerned about the evil of faction, but they also, they're later on in our history, there were folks who correctly recognized that the parties were extra constitutional. They were not written in the Constitution, but they played a key role shaping political debate, trying to make sure that ideas that were a little bit too outlandish got pulled back into some kind of median and so on. That's also not playing a role. Parties have been weaker for a lot of reasons for time in the last couple of decades, including the way campaign finance works. So then ultimately you're left with the two ultimate constraints to my mind, which are the morality and the enlightened self-interest of the general public and the markets, as it were. Now, markets don't have a lot of morality, but I'm not prepared to say the private sector is immoral. I think that people are moved by moral considerations up to a point. But elections and markets take a while to work. And they also are at risk if there are other things that begin to happen in administration that squelch the independence of markets and the public. So that's why I end up with three constraints that I think play a key role in buying time for the public and the markets to figure out what they really feel about an administration. The courts, as Jack said, federalism, the fact that not everything is run out of DC. You have governors, state legislators, state Supreme Courts with independent sovereign power to some degree. And then you've got the media and the ideas sector that report on what the courts do, what's actually happening. And even if that doesn't ultimately reach every little bit of the polity, at least some people care about that, and that ends up playing a role.
Are either of you impressed or depressed by the, I guess, civil society / public dimension of the pushback. I mean, civil society. I mean, I'm not an objective observer. My son works for Democracy Forward, which is an extraordinary organization. You know, you've had 350 lawsuits according to New York Times since the first week in May, 120 plus pushbacks in various forms. Does that impress or depress you?
I don't know if there's anything in between impress and depress. Maybe it's just press. But I would say it's hard to put it in impressed or depressed. Just my opening thought about this would be, in some ways, the American system is working as it was designed to, or at least as we've designed it to, we over time in history, in that the president's approval rating goes up, goes down. It's going down right now. The courts are filled with lawsuits, as one is not surprised, given everything we've talked about. And so civil society is acting as though they have constitutional rights that they can exercise, as they do, and they should. Now, how that plays out over another 2-3 years is an interesting question, which we can talk about. But right now, I sense response. And I think that, you know, is it enough? One could argue that, but I think there's definitely vigor to the response.
Jack, a thought on this?
I basically agree with what Tino said. I mean, I would say that it's vital, and whether it's sufficient remains to be seen. I mean, it's not just in courts. It's civil society. I'm thinking of civil society broadly as, you know, non-governmental institutions that watch and inform the public about and push back against the government. And it's taking place through courts. The question is whether it starts to take place through politics as the president's ratings continue to decline. If they do, as the midterm elections get closer, that seems to me to be very important. And civil society has a role there. The press has a role there. The people have a role there. It remains to be seen how that will play out, though. So I guess I basically agree with what Tino said.
Well, I want to add something else if we could before we go on. Now, I'll grant you this is a session on Trump and the courts, so it's not about civil society or about the political process exactly, although in many ways these things all converge to some degree. I just want to note that there are many people in America who feel frustrated by what they see or have seen from government over years and decades. And, you know, part of it is the point Jack makes in his excellent article about how presidential overreach was not invented by this administration, to be clear. And there are instances you can point to in the Biden administration, in other administrations where there's a real argument that maybe presidents went too far. But also, like, if you look at how long it takes to get a passport or to build a bridge or to build a high-speed rail line, there's no question that people can legitimately be frustrated with government. And so I do think another piece of this conversation is, in the end, the courts ought not to micromanage things. They're meant to set some parameters and limits and allow the democratic process to play out so people can duke it out over what the right way is to reform government, but within some guardrails.
You led your foreign affairs piece with a wonderful vignette of South Korea. And it's impossible to compare. I mean, again, in my area of expertise in 2023, you saw a country just shy of 10 million people, the Israelis, mount protests, demonstrations for 42 weeks in a row, in which hundreds of thousands of people actually cohered around what they believe to be a relatively unified vision of their own country. Now, I'm old, I'm prejudging this, but I just don't know how much a part of that, of the opposition, is geared to the fact that it would be very hard to get hundreds of thousands of Americans out into the streets in defense of what America is, what it should be. Am I being too hard here? I mean, organization, direct actions, peaceful, of course, around a unified concept. I don't know whether that's possible in this country. And if it's not possible, I wonder if that is a real vulnerability in terms of how an administration with authoritarian tendencies is operating. I mean, they would claim they're nationalists and patriots, and yet they're undermining the very political contract of a liberal democracy, rule of law, constitutionalism, guards against self-dealing and corruption. How much is that? Am I off here, or is that worth
I mean,
a point,
I'm not
point
sure,
or two?
I'm not sure what the question is exactly. I mean, look, the fact that you don't see the kind of protests that you're talking about is this is outside of my expertise. So
Big country.
take it for its worth. But it's a big country, and also, you know, we saw protests against Trump in the first time, and we're not seeing them this time.
Yep.
To the same degree, even though he's acting more extremely. I don't know what to make of that, but it suggests that the opposition has not found an organizing principle that gets people to do that. And I can't explain that. I don't have a theory of that.
There may be something to that, but here's a thought, like so many, I think, partly just to advance the conversation a little bit. I think the question of how society responds when some renegotiation of the social and political contract is underway, one that might be, in the end, potentially quite costly, is partly a function of the structures of government themselves, right? So I would note that one important difference between South Korea and the U.S., also between Israel and the U.S., is that the other two countries, aside from the U.S., are not federal to start with.
Right.
So here, hypothetically, if there's some Supreme Court decision that says to the administration, no, you don't have the right to order states to act this particular way, and the administration says, well, we don't care, we're just going to do it anyway, then the public doesn't have zero option other than just to protest en masse. They have a bunch of elected leaders that also have a relationship with the public that can say, well, we're going to ignore what the administration says if it's unlawful based on what the U.S. Supreme Court says, right? So if there are other structures to channel the kind of back and forth politically, I'm not saying that protests have not played an important role in American history and may not play a role in our future history. But I'm just noting you have to think about the federalism piece, the separated branches, and other ways in which these countries are different.
Yeah. All right. In the last few minutes that remain, let's talk about the one thing that is hardest to talk about, which is the future. So listen to David Posen, professor of law at Columbia University Law School. Quote, I think it is fair to conclude that the U.S. constitutional system is on the verge of an authoritarian takeover. Authoritarian constitutionalism, in air quotes, is not an oxymoron. Unless the Trump takeover is repelled, our system will retain the familiar constitutional forms while becoming ever more illiberal, undemocratic, and corrupt, unquote. So it's the whole notion of competitive authoritarianism, that you can maintain the trappings of liberal government and still, on key issues, retain control to undermine the very democracy that you presumably are supporting. Is that a possible outcome, the so-called dual state? This German lawyer in the 30s, Ernst Frankl talked about it, where you had a normative state and a prerogative state. One's a zone of legality, the other is a legal abyss. Is that a future? Or is it possible? A liberal democracy? I don't know how it's described by the political scientists. Jack?
I'm not sure I understand the concept. I'll just throw a little bomb in the question by saying that my Trump-loving friends think that's what happened under the Biden administration. I'm quite serious.
Right. No, I hear you.
And with the deep state and with the government pressuring social media and with the weaponization of the Justice Department and the legal system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think we're on I don't understand, I apologize, I just don't understand how to operationalize those concepts. I think we're on a bad path, and the question is what happens next, and I can't predict the future. We could descend into a form of soft authoritarianism. That's one possible path. That is not what I think will happen, but it might happen. We could also see tit for tat. Trump is in some sense a response to what came before, and if and when the Democrats get back in power, we can expect them to use these new tools against their enemies, and you could see a downward spiraling tit for tat that leaves us in a bad place. Or, and this is what counts This is what counts as hopeful. This administration or the reaction to this administration could take us to such a bad place that both sides finally think, and I mean both in the populace and in the political classes, that there needs to be a ceasefire and a reset about checks and balances, separation of powers, and the power of the presidency.
Right.
I don't think we can predict what's going to happen. I think those are three possible paths.
And the more hopeful path would mean a binary political system with two parties that actually function, that there's consensus compromise without demonization and without one-upmanship.
Without undue demonization of one-upmanship.
Exactly.
But yeah, having it under control. Again, I don't know how we get there because we're very far from that now, and the institutions that kind of produced a compromising middle are kind of dead now. But I do think that something like a reset to that is conceivable when things get really bad.
But you're not predicting all these dystopic futures for the country. That's what I hear in your effort to balance it out.
I said that there are three. I sketched three scenarios.
You did.
The first was pretty pessimistic.
Right.
And I don't think anyone knows, to be frank.
Yeah.
I think it's folly to predict the future too far in advance. I mean, the economy went off the cliff tomorrow, which it well could. We could go in one direction. It's just we really have had very little engagement thus far by the Supreme Court. We have not had a round of elections yet. Yes, Trump's doing a lot of changes before these other mechanisms kick in, but I just think it's very, very early.
Yeah. Tino.
Yeah, I think I'm concerned about what's happening because I think it's unfortunate and is creating unnecessary friction and questions about the core nature of American democracy. But, and let me add, before I get to the but, another thing I just would acknowledge, which is even if there is an equilibrating process where people respond to this level of chaos and violation of norms in a way that maybe reaffirms core American values and American democratic structures, a lot of people will get affected in the meantime. People who might have been benefiting from some USAID funding that is now getting disrupted in some way, and even if a court were to conceivably reinstitute some of that funding, like there could be medical things that happened to them in the meantime that were affected by the funding, government employees that have been summarily fired, in some cases are going to be hired back, but in many cases their lives are just on a different trajectory now. So I don't want to minimize how massive these changes are, even in the short time frame we've been around. But to Jack's point, I feel like it's important to realize that even if we can't predict the future, there are some things that we can probably discern, little patterns that might be helpful in moving the American democratic conversation about how our democracy best meets the needs of its people within the legal traditions we have and advancing America's interests abroad as well, like all of that together, that start to become a little clear. And here I'm riffing a little bit off the nice work of our scholar Rachel Kleinfeld, who wrote a prescient piece about 5 strategies to buttress American democracy. I'm also riffing a little bit off some work that I've done and published in the past. The first thing I'd note is that cross-ideological coalitions are pretty critical here. This is why, I differ with Professor Posen, whom I really admire, but maybe slightly on the rhetoric piece. I think it's not super helpful to pitch the rhetoric at quite that level of intensity right now. But is there real value in building a cross-ideological coalition that stands up for free and fair elections, for federalism, for the important role of the courts in upholding the rule of law, for sensible limits on presidential power? This is part of what Jack talked about in his article. Absolutely. Second, the frustrations that are playing into people's questions about the future of democracy sometimes are born from real limitations inside government. So can we actually take seriously the considerations people have put on the table about how inefficiently government can run sometimes, and also the importance of taking seriously the state and local level and making sure that layer of government, which frankly is where 89% of all government employees actually works really effectively. Third, can we all appreciate that we have constitutional rights that people can use right now to go to court and have their day in court, to speak up, to publish articles that they want to publish? Let's be totally clear, right? There are many, many, many countries in the world where the label soft authoritarianism applies, where people really cannot do that and stay safe. Finally, I think it's important to distinguish places where we can critique what the president is doing, but it's fairly clear the president has enormous power and leeway to strike a different course So I'd note international relations, and particularly the Ukraine piece, and places where there's an actual limit imposed by the law. And the norms are somewhere in between. But I think we have to be clear about those distinctions in order to build these cross-ideological coalitions I'm talking about.
I mean, in the final paragraph of your article, Tino, you talked about keeping your eye on the ball. Well, you conceded you can't fight on everything,
Yes.
but you have to fight,
And,
right?
and to be clear, I'm not suggesting people shouldn't criticize the policies they think are very problematic. But when it gets to protecting the constitutional and democratic process, we should be clear about putting first and foremost free and fair elections, freedom of speech and expression, right? Limits set by the rule of law that are unambiguous, and start from there.
You know, I'd close by quoting Jack Kennedy, who described himself as an idealist without illusion. And frankly, that's where I am. I'd like to think that's where the two of you are.
An idealist,
but not
without
detached from
illusions.
reality.
An idealist without illusions is much better than an illusionist without ideals.
Yeah, fair enough. Jack Goldsmith, Tino Cuéllar, thank you so much for sharing 45 minutes with us. There's a lot to unpack here, and I learned a ton, and I'm sure everyone who watched will as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have to go out and save the Republic. Take care.
Thank you.
Yep.